Hello, everyone, and happy NASH. My name is Molly Harry, and I'm from the University of Virginia, and today I'll be going over History Repeats Itself, Path Dependence, and Intercollegiate Athletics. So to dive on in, just a short presentation outline here, I'm going to provide an introduction, a little bit of context about the NCAA, go through the theoretical framework of path dependence from Saito and colleagues, then move into the literature review, really focusing on three main areas: the home rule, which we're seeing a return to, name, image, and likeness, or NIL, and the NCAA's new constitution that was ratified recently in January 2022. And then I'll move into the discussion section and perhaps some future areas to consider path dependence theory besides outside of name, image, likeness, and the NCAA's new constitution. So brief introduction here. Due to President Theodore Roosevelt's demands, the NCAA in the early 1900s really began as a safety and fair play focused governing body. However, at its foundation, it really struggled to gain regularity control over college sports. And during this period, the NCAA really allowed and gave much autonomy to its institutions to govern and police themselves, and this policy was known as the home rule. As more schools began to follow the safety and fair play rules that were implemented by the association, the organization was able to expand its control and regulatory power into other areas, and it quickly adopted a host of other policies such as amateurism, institutional control, and ethical conduct, which it adopted almost 100 years ago and still has today as well. But during this time period, the home rule sort of dissolved and the NCAA began to more centrally and authoritatively govern its member institutions. However, we're currently experiencing some major shifts in college athletics, from Alston v. NCAA court cases, athletes' potential to become employees, conference realignment, and important for this presentation here, the NCAA's new constitution and name, image, likeness. With these shifts, the field is really experiencing a return to the home rule. And this return is understood through path dependence theory. Path dependence theory is a common organizational theory in higher education. And Saito and colleagues define a path as a rigidified, potentially inefficient action pattern built up by the unintended consequences of previous decisions and positive reinforcing feedback processes. Path dependence theory argues that the current institution conditions or features are shaped by a sequence of previous actions and decisions that result in a particular outcome. Really simply put, essentially where an institution has been shapes where it is now and influences where it's headed in the future. And as Misra 2020 notes in that quotation there, it's really the inability to shake free of history. Path dependence can be cognitive, cultural, and procedural, and these are all involved in the NCAA. Cognitive is how we understand things, maybe perhaps how the NCAA has socialized us to understand things. Cultural, how it relates to maintenance and norms of values, perhaps amateurism. And then procedural, how things are done, maybe through the NCAA's legislative process, has been called archaic and bureaucratic at times. So, and also all those things are very much rooted in history of the association, thus the inability to shake free of that history. Importantly, as that next bullet states, decisions and actions accumulate over time to develop the current situation and environment of an organization such as the NCAA, and it can become increasingly difficult to reverse paths and potentially find a new path that's more efficient or better suited for a certain or current context. And this is why history repeats itself, because it's a little bit easier to go back to what we've always done rather than form that new path. Next up, we have the home rule. In the home rule, as it related to amateurism, most importantly here, noted that each member had to enact and enforce measures as may be necessary to prevent violations of the principles of amateur sport. So reforms in legislation, again, as mentioned on the introduction side, were really left up to the individual institutions for much of the NCAA's infancy period. Thus, at this point in time, the home rule really allowed for decentralization and institutional autonomy there. Over the last several decades, the NCAA has taken a more centralized approach to governing its over 1,000 plus member institutions. And that centralization is pretty clearly evidenced in its 400 plus page manual. However, two recent and important shifts in college athletics are signaling a return to the home rule. These include athletes' rights to profit from their name, image, and likeness, and the NCAA's recently passed new constitution from 2022. So, real quickly, name, image, and likeness. So, NIL is someone's right of publicity, and it's a right that has historically been denied to college athletes due to violations that NIL access would have to the NCAA's main principle of amateurism. And also, NIL could further professionalize college athletics, which again would go against that amateurism principle. Beginning with California's Fair Pay to Play Act in 2019, other states began proposing and passing bills that would make it illegal for colleges to deny athletes the right to monetize their name, image, likeness. And thus, the NCAA was forced in the summer of 2021 to allow athletes to profit from their name, image, likeness. So the state's legislation really forced the NCAA's hands here. Rather than establishing clear sanction guidelines across the association, the NCAA really opted to leave most of the enforcement and the education about name, image, likeness policies and other guidelines in the hands of individual institutions and athletics departments leaders. This represents a return to the home rule and is an example of a reliance on history and previous decision-making styles that the NCAA has adopted. Importantly, there are some potential concerns with equity with this model. Some states are more strict than others when it comes to what athletes can or cannot do with their name, image, likeness. Some schools and states allow athletes to use institutional marks and logos to promote their brands, and other schools don't. So access to NIL and the ability to profit is not necessarily equal across the association. And this may lead to tensions between athletics programs and the national office of the NCAA. Such examples were recently seen with jabs between football coaches Jimbo Fisher and Lane Kiffin in the SEC about name, image, likeness and its roles in potentially recruiting athletes or serving as a recruiting inducement to get athletes to attend certain schools. And most recently, we saw issues with this concerning a quarterback who signed with a lucrative deal with a school's collective, and that certainly caused a lot of uproar related to name, image, likeness. But how does this relate to the home rule? This is not unlike the early days of the home rule, where these similar issues arose about paying college athletes athletic scholarships before athletic scholarships were allowed by the NCAA, and how this relates to potentially under-the-table payments before scholarships were implemented as well. So this is really just reminiscent of some of the earlier issues related to athletes receiving pay for participating in summer baseball leagues in the late 1800s and early 1900s as well. So with this home rule, schools are not only policing themselves, but they're also starting to worry about the policies and policing each other. And this has been a historic concern of the NCAA, again, harkening back to that history and that path dependence as well. And then regarding the new NCAA Constitution, at the annual convention in January 2022, the NCAA passed its new Constitution. There are some similarities and there are some differences with this new document here. So some similarities include that the NCAA is still seeking to improve college athletics programs for athletes, promote educational leadership, publish rules of play, and cooperate with outside athletics organizations and events such as the Olympics. However, there are some really key changes that harken back to the home rule. These changes include encouraging members to adopt their own eligibility rules pertaining to scholarship and sportsmanship, perhaps related to name, image, likeness, and legislate concerns of members related to college athletics themselves. So, more autonomy. This results in more autonomy for larger institutions, which is much like the early years of the association. Smith 2021 notes that the NCAA did not want small-time colleges directing them, the bigger institutions, on how to run athletics. But this new constitution does exactly just that. So those same fears are creeping up again. This new constitution allows for the more commercialized conferences, divisions, institutions to maintain their dominance, much like the old home rule enabled in the early years of the NCAA. And importantly, these changes really push back on the institutions, more responsibility and autonomy on how they want to operate as well. So, to wrap up here, a short discussion. So, if history really does repeat itself, as the old adage says, scholars and practitioners in and of athletics should have seen this shift in college sports coming. Arguably, however, many in athletics were really unprepared for this more sudden and hands off approach and the deregulation of the collegiate model, if you will. One NCAA official even stated in an NIL video that we, the national office, will be operating in a more decentralized approach, more than what you're used to, which I think is just very interesting. And again, really going back to the importance of the home rule and the return to the home rule we are seeing. And that's particularly concerning legislation related to name, image, likeness. So rather than being prepared, what has resulted is chaos in sports departments as they've struggled to address athlete questions and impending NIL agreements and adjustments to a more decentralized regulatory structure as a result of name, image, likeness, but also the new constitution. Importantly, there are some other areas to consider path dependence and this return to the home rule going forward. So I think the biggest one could be federal involvement. Much like Congress attempted to form a regulatory body over intercollegiate sport in the mid 20th century, Representative Shalala proposed a similar deal in 2019 with her Congressional Advisory Commission on Intercollegiate Athletics. In a similar vein, the NCAA has constantly requested federal involvement in the early years, and this is being emphasized again now with the association really advocating and seeking congressional and federal support for a national policy related to name, image, likeness rather than a state by state or patchwork sort of approach that we're seeing right now. We may see also a return to the home rule related to infractions and NCAA violations, likely to become a little more decentralized, and perhaps the NCAA will have a little less teeth like it did in the early 1900s when it was first formed. It's likely that college sports may still need a body or a committee to regulate itself, but perhaps, again, it's not as centralized, much like the NCAA in its early years. And then finally, perhaps related to academic regulations, the NCAA has sort of gone back and forth in its academic control, taking a hands-off and then a hands-on approach related to academic requirements for athletes, admissions, and things like that. And perhaps with Austin funds and the confusions that can cause and the autonomy institutions have to implement that funding mechanism or not, we may see a return to a more hands-off approach in the home rule once again. Here are my references, and thank you so much for attending. I hope y'all enjoy the rest of the conference.